It all started, as these things so often do, not with a bang, but with a phone call. A perfectly ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I was in the garage, meticulously labeling a newly acquired set of antique woodworking chisels. The scent of cedar shavings and old oil a familiar comfort. The sun was slanting through the small window, catching dust motes dancing in the air. My own little slice of productive paradise. My wife, Clara, was out at her book club, and the house was quiet save for the hum of the dehumidifier I kept running in the garage to protect my tools and projects. Then my cell phone, perched precariously on a stack of neatly piled lumber, buzzed with an unfamiliar number. I wiped my hands on a rag, a small sigh escaping me, probably another robocall trying to sell me an extended car warranty for a vehicle I hadn't owned in a decade. Still, I answered. "Hello, Mark speaking." The voice on the other end was crisp, cold, and carried an unmistakable air of self-importance. "Mr. Mark Jenkins? This is Harold Banks, legal counsel for the Pleasant Valley Homeowners Association." My heart did a little stutter-step. The HOA? I'd paid my dues on time, kept my lawn immaculate, even won their yard of the month once, much to Clara's amusement. What could they possibly want? "Yes, this is Mark Jenkins," I replied, a sliver of unease creeping into my voice. "Mr. Jenkins," Banks continued, his tone dripping with condescension, "it has come to the attention of the board that your garage, located at 124 Willow Creek Drive, is in violation of Section 7, subsection B, paragraph 4 of the Community Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions, pertaining to the maintenance of property in an orderly and sightly condition. Specifically, your garage has been reported and subsequently verified as constituting a hoarder garage." I felt a flush creep up my neck. "A hoarder garage?" I repeated, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. My garage? Yes, it was full of my life's passions. My woodworking tools, neatly arranged on pegboards or in custom-built cabinets. My vintage radio restoration projects, each tagged and cataloged. Shelves groaning, yes, but with organized boxes of seasonal decorations we'd accumulated over 30 years of marriage, items for the annual charity drive I coordinated, and the disassembled parts of a 1967 Triumph Bonneville I was painstakingly bringing back to life. Every item had a place, a purpose. Hoarding implies a chaotic, indiscriminate accumulation of useless junk, a mental affliction. This was an insult. "Mr. Banks," I said, trying to keep my voice even, "I believe there's been a serious misunderstanding. My garage is a workshop and storage space. It is highly organized, and frankly, it's not visible from the street unless the door is open, which it rarely is for extended periods. And even then, it's my private space." He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Mr. Jenkins, the HOA has received photographic evidence. The sheer volume of material is indicative of a hoarding situation, creating potential fire hazards and negatively impacting community aesthetics should the door be open, however briefly. We are not interested in your personal definitions of organization. The board requires immediate abatement of this violation. You have 14 days to bring the garage into compliance, failing which the HOA will initiate legal proceedings to compel compliance, including all associated legal fees and daily fines. We trust this clarifies the situation." Clarifies? It was as clear as mud and twice as suffocating. "A fire hazard?" I'm a retired electrical engineer. I knew more about fire safety than probably anyone on that board, and my garage was meticulously maintained with clear pathways and fire extinguishers readily accessible. Negatively impacting community aesthetics? From inside my closed garage? This was beyond absurd. It was an invasion. "Who reported this?" I demanded, my voice rising despite my best efforts. "And how is this verification conducted? Was someone trespassing on my property?" Banks's voice became even more glacial. "The source of the report is confidential, Mr. Jenkins. An observation was made during a period when your garage door was open from a permissible vantage point. The evidence is clear. You have your 14-day notice. I suggest you use that time wisely. Good day," and he hung up. I stood there, phone in hand, the silence of the garage suddenly oppressive. The scent of cedar now seemed cloying. My sanctuary, my workspace, my meticulously ordered haven, had been branded a hoarder garage by some faceless accuser and a smug, overzealous lawyer. The indignation was a hot wave, followed by a cold determination. They had picked the wrong retired engineer to bully. This wasn't just about a garage. It was about privacy, about respect, about the petty tyrannies that can fester in seemingly placid suburban landscapes. My first thought was who would do this? And why? Was it Henderson, the HOA president, a man whose ramrod posture and perpetual scowl seemed to indicate a deep-seated dissatisfaction with anyone not adhering to his rigid, unwritten code of conduct? Or perhaps Mrs. Gable from across the street, whose prize-winning roses were her only joy and who seemed to view any deviation from her idea of perfect suburbia as a personal affront? The call had been a declaration of war, whether they knew it or not. My mind, trained to solve complex engineering problems, immediately began to shift from outrage to analysis. This Harold Banks, with his slick threats, was just a mouthpiece. The real issue lay with the HOA board and their interpretation or misinterpretation of those CC and RS. I remembered the thick booklet I'd received when we bought the house filed away somewhere. It was time to dust it off. The fight, I sensed, was just beginning, and I wasn't about to let them steamroll me. My garage wasn't just a collection of things, it was a testament to a life lived with passion and purpose, and I'd be damned if I let them call it a dump. The chisels I'd been labeling suddenly felt less like tools and more like potential weapons in a very different kind of battle. The first thing I did after that infuriating call with Harold Banks was to unearth the Pleasant Valley Homeowners Association covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Clara found it tucked away in the filing cabinet under H4 headache-inducing documents, which, in retrospect, was remarkably prescient. It was a dense, 50-page document filled with legalese, designed, I suspect, more to intimidate than to inform. I spread it out on the kitchen table, a fresh pot of coffee brewing, and began to dissect it, section by section, armed with a highlighter and a healthy dose of skepticism. Section 7, subsection B, paragraph 4, the one Banks had so officiously quoted, stated, "All lots and improvements thereon shall be maintained by the owner in a clean, safe, and sightly condition, free of noxious weeds, debris, and any condition that may constitute a nuisance or unreasonably interfere with the quiet enjoyment of other owners." There it was. Vague. Sightly condition, nuisance, these were subjective terms open to wildly different interpretations. Crucially, there was no specific mention of garage interiors, especially when not visible from common areas. How could the inside of my closed garage constitute a nuisance or be unsightly to others? This reeked of overreach. I spent the rest of that evening and much of the next day poring over every clause, every amendment. I cross-referenced definitions, looked for loopholes, and tried to understand the scope of the HOA's authority. As an engineer, I appreciate well-defined parameters and clear logic. This document was a swamp of ambiguity. Clara, bless her heart, was initially more inclined to conciliation. "Mark, maybe just tidy it up a bit? Move some of the bigger boxes to the attic? It's not worth a legal battle." But when I explained the sheer arrogance of the lawyer, the accusation of hoarding, and the utter lack of specific charges, her own sense of justice flared. "They can't just do that," she declared, suddenly my staunchest ally. "It's your space. What about Mr. Henderson's 3 rusting lawnmowers sitting by his shed? Or Mrs. Gable's collection of garden gnomes that look like they're plotting something sinister? Are they sightly?" Her point was well taken. Selective enforcement was a common complaint in many HOAs. I made a mental note to discreetly document the state of other properties, purely for comparative purposes, of course. 2 days later, the formal warning letter arrived via certified mail, as if to underscore their seriousness. It reiterated Banks's points, included grainy, zoomed-in photographs of my garage interior, clearly taken from across the street when I'd had the door open for about 10 minutes to air it out while I swept, and demanded a remediation plan. Within the now-reduced time frame of 12 days. The photos were particularly galling. They were angled to make the space look as chaotic as possible, focusing on stacks of neatly labeled boxes and deliberately avoiding the clear walkways and organized tool walls. This wasn't just a complaint, this was a curated attack. The letter was signed by Arthur Henderson, HOA president. So, my initial suspicion was confirmed. Henderson, a retired middle manager with an ego far exceeding his actual authority, was likely the driving force. I remembered a minor run-in with him a year prior when I'd politely questioned the sudden, unexplained increase in landscaping fees at an HOA meeting. He hadn't liked being challenged, his face tightening like a drum. Was this payback, dressed up as community concern? The letter also mentioned anonymous complaints from concerned neighbors, plural. This suggested either Henderson was exaggerating or Mrs. Gable wasn't his only recruit. I started a new file, meticulously logging every communication, every date, every detail. I took my own set of photographs of the garage, wide shots showing the overall layout, close-ups of the organization systems I'd built, the clear labeling on boxes, the inventoried parts for my triumph. I even filmed a walkthrough, narrating the purpose of each section. If they wanted evidence, I'd give them evidence, but it would be my evidence, contextualized and accurate. My engineering mind was now fully engaged. This was a system, and systems could be understood, analyzed, and, if necessary, challenged. The HOA operated under a set of rules, their CC and RS, but they were also bound by state laws governing homeowners associations. My next step was to research those laws. Were there limits to their aesthetic policing, especially concerning private, enclosed spaces? Could they legally define hoarding without any professional assessment or clear, pre-existing guidelines? The more I delved, the more I suspected their case was built on a foundation of hot air and Henderson's personal pique. The threat of legal action was a classic bullying tactic, designed to make homeowners capitulate quickly to avoid cost and hassle. But they hadn't counted on my stubbornness or my newfound determination to see this through. This wasn't just about my garage anymore. It was about principle. They were trying to define what I could do inside my own home, based on a fleeting glimpse and a distorted interpretation of vague rules. The arrogance was breathtaking. Clara, now fully on board, suggested we talk to a lawyer. I agreed it might be necessary, but I wanted to gather my own facts first. Lawyers were expensive, and I had a feeling that a well-reasoned, evidence-backed response might just make Mr. Banks and Mr. Henderson think twice before escalating this to a courtroom. The initial shock was wearing off, replaced by a focused resolve. They wanted a fight? They were about to get one, but it would be fought on my terms, with logic, evidence, and an unyielding refusal to be intimidated. The neatly labeled chisels on my workbench seemed to gleam with a new purpose. The HOA's demand for a remediation plan and an inspection felt like a charade, but I knew I couldn't just ignore it. According to the CC and RS, they did have the right to inspect for compliance with community standards, though the application of those standards to the interior of a closed garage was still highly debatable in my mind. I decided to allow an inspection, but strictly on my terms. I drafted a polite but firm email to Mr. Henderson, CCNG Harold Banks, stating that I would permit a visual inspection from the threshold of the garage door. They would not be permitted to enter the garage, touch anything, or dictate how I organized my personal workspace beyond demonstrable safety concerns, which I confidently asserted did not exist. I specified a date and a narrow time window, making it clear that this was my only availability. I also requested in writing the specific criteria they were using to define a hoarder garage and what constituted compliance in their view. Unsurprisingly, I received no reply to my request for criteria, just a curt email from Henderson confirming their attendance for the inspection at the time I'd specified. He'd be accompanied by another board member. The day of the inspection dawned gray and drizzly, perfectly matching my mood. Clara, ever supportive, offered to be present, but I felt it was better if I handled this myself, calmly and methodically. At precisely 10 a.m., Henderson's oversized SUV pulled up to the curb. He emerged, dressed in a golf shirt and slacks that seemed a size too tight, his expression one of grim satisfaction. Trailing him was Agnes Periwinkle, the board's secretary, a woman whose pursed lips and perpetually disapproving gaze could curdle milk. Agnes clutched a clipboard like it was a holy relic. I met them at the end of my driveway, maintaining a polite but neutral distance. Mr. Henderson, Ms. Periwinkle, I greeted them. Thank you for coming, Henderson grunted. Agnes just stared past me towards the garage as if expecting rats to scurry out. I led them to the garage and, with a small flourish, pressed the remote. The door rumbled upwards, revealing the interior. I had deliberately left it exactly as it was, my organized, functional, and yes, very full space. No last-minute tidying to appease them. This was about principle. From the threshold, they peered in. I saw Henderson's eyes scan the shelves laden with categorized boxes, the wall of tools, the draped form of my Bonneville project. Agnes made little tisk-tisk sounds and scribbled furiously on her clipboard. As you can see, I began, my voice calm and measured, this is a working garage. Here, I gestured, is my woodworking station. All tools are properly stored. The lumber is stacked and sorted. Over there are parts for my classic motorcycle restoration, each inventoried and labeled. These boxes, I pointed to a neat stack, contain items for the annual children's charity toy drive I organize. They are sorted by age group and ready for distribution next month. And this area is for seasonal storage, holiday decorations, camping gear, all clearly marked and accessible, Henderson scoffed. Accessible? Jenkins, it looks like a bloody junkyard. There's hardly room to breathe in there. This is precisely what we're talking about. It's an eyesore and a fire hazard, I countered, my calm unwavering. Mr. Henderson, I am a retired electrical engineer. I can assure you, this garage exceeds all fire safety codes. I have 2 commercial-grade fire extinguishers clearly visible and recently inspected. There are clear pathways, as you can see if you look properly. Nothing is blocking ventilation, and all flammable materials are stored in approved containers, far from any ignition sources. Perhaps you could point out the specific fire code violation you observe. He waved a dismissive hand. It's the sheer volume, Jenkins. It's just too much. It's what any reasonable person would call hoarding. A reasonable person is a subjective standard, Mr. Henderson, I replied. The term hoarding has a clinical definition often associated with unsanitary conditions and an inability to discard useless items. None of that applies here. Every item has a purpose or sentimental value, and the space is clean and organized for its intended functions. Are you a qualified professional to diagnose hoarding? Agnes Periwinkle finally spoke, her voice thin and reedy. The rules state sightly condition, Mr. Jenkins. This is hardly sightly, Miss Periwinkle, I said, turning to her. The CC and RS refer to sightly condition, generally for lots and improvements thereon traditionally. This applies to the exterior appearance of homes and landscaping, things visible to the community. My garage door is closed 99% of the time. Are you suggesting the HOA now has jurisdiction over the interior aesthetics of private, enclosed spaces, even if they meet all safety and structural codes? She blinked, momentarily flustered, and scribbled something else on her clipboard. Henderson, however, was undeterred. This is unacceptable, Jenkins. You've clearly made no effort to remediate the situation. You'll be hearing from our lawyer. This inspection is over. He turned on his heel, Agnes scurrying after him. As they reached the end of the driveway, Henderson called back over his shoulder. And those fines start accruing as of today. I slowly lowered the garage door, the rumble echoing in the suddenly quiet space. The inspection had gone exactly as I expected. They weren't interested in facts or reason. They were interested in asserting their power. Their minds were already made up. The fire hazard claim was particularly galling, given my professional background. It was a baseless accusation designed to add weight to their flimsy case. The unsightly claim for an interior space was, in my opinion, legally tenuous. But they had the lawyer and they had the power to levy fines, at least initially. The next day, another letter arrived. Garage inspection failure. It stated that the condition remained in gross violation and that daily fines of $50 were now being applied, retroactive to the end of the initial 14-day notice. They demanded, yet again, a detailed written plan for the complete clearing and reorganization of the garage to meet community standards within 7 days, or the matter would be formally handed over to banks to initiate a lawsuit. Complete clearing? Reorganization to meet their undefined standards? This was an ultimatum, a declaration of total war on my personal space and hobbies. My resolve, already firm, solidified into something harder. This wasn't just about my garage anymore. This was about standing up to bullies who draped themselves in the thin veneer of community rules to exercise their petty vendettas. My engineering training had taught me to solve problems systematically. Their problem was their perception. My problem was their power. It was time to start working on a solution that addressed both. The fines were an irritant, but I would formally dispute each one, creating a paper trail of my objections and their unreasonable demands. The threat of a lawsuit was more serious, but I was beginning to feel that if it came to that, my meticulous documentation and the sheer absurdity of their claims would stand me in good stead. They thought they had me cornered. They had no idea how resourceful a retired engineer with a lifetime of organized clutter and a very strong sense of indignation could be. The daily fines started to accumulate, each notification arriving with a smug little note from the HOA management company. $50 a day. It was designed to bleed me, to make me surrender out of financial exhaustion. But I wasn't playing their game. For every fine notification, I drafted a formal, polite, but firm dispute letter, sent via certified mail with return receipt requested. In each letter, I reiterated that their claims were baseless, that they had failed to provide any specific, written criteria for a hoarder garage, or demonstrate any actual violation of clearly defined CC and RS pertaining to the interior of a private, enclosed space. I also stated that I considered their actions to be harassment and an abuse of their authority, and I reserved the right to recover all unlawfully imposed fines. This meticulous exchange of correspondence was building my defense, brick by evidentiary brick. Meanwhile, Clara, bless her pragmatic soul, had started looking into local lawyers specializing in HOA disputes. "Just in case, Mark," she'd said. "It's good to know our options," I agreed. But I wasn't ready to hand this over yet. I felt a personal stake in dismantling their arguments myself. My investigation into the HOA's conduct deepened. I started attending the monthly HOA board meetings, not to speak initially, just to observe. I sat in the back, taking copious notes. Arthur Henderson presided like a minor potentate, his pronouncements often arbitrary, his handling of dissenting opinions dismissive. Agnes Periwinkle dutifully recorded minutes that seemed to gloss over any controversial points, presenting a picture of harmonious governance that was far from the reality I was witnessing. It was during one of these meetings that I found a potential ally. A woman named Sarah Miller, a younger resident who lived on the next street, stood up to question a sudden, poorly explained special assessment for repaving the community pool parking lot, a lot that seemed perfectly fine to most people. Henderson tried to shut her down using his usual blustery tactics, but Sarah stood her ground, calmly asking for detailed costings and alternative bids. She was articulate, clearly intelligent, and unafraid. After the meeting, I approached her. "Excuse me, Ms. Miller? I'm Mark Jenkins. I admired your tenacity in there," she smiled, a wry, knowing look in her eyes. "Thanks. Someone has to ask the questions, right? Otherwise, they just railroad everything through. Henderson acts like the HOA dues are his personal piggy bank." We talked for a while. I cautiously mentioned my own garage situation. Her eyes widened. "You're the Hoarder garage guy? Oh, I've heard Henderson grumbling about that. He's been on a tear about property values and unsightly elements lately. Honestly, most of us think he's overreacting." As usual, Sarah, it turned out, was a paralegal. While not an HOA specialist, she had a good understanding of procedural fairness and the importance of documentation. She offered to look over my correspondence with the HOA and the CC and RS. "No charge," she said. "I just hate seeing bullies get away with it." Her input was invaluable. She pointed out a few clauses in the CC and RS regarding due process and the requirement for specific, written notices of violation, which she felt the HOA was skirting with their vague accusations. She also suggested I make a Freedom of Information Act-style request or its state equivalent for HOAs for all records related to the complaints against my garage, including the original complaints themselves, anonymized if necessary. But I wanted to see the wording and any internal board discussions or votes on the matter. "They'll probably try to stonewall you," she warned, "but they are legally obligated to provide certain records to homeowners armed with this new avenue." I also began my discreet survey of other properties. I took my dog for long walks around the neighborhood, my phone camera ready. It wasn't hard to find examples of what could, by Henderson's loose standards, be considered unsightly. There was Mr. Henderson's own collection of rusting lawnmowers next to his shed, clearly visible from the street. There was a house with an old boat on a trailer in the driveway covered with a tattered blue tarp that had been there for months. Several homes had overflowing trash cans left out for days or peeling paint that the aesthetics committee, chaired by Agnes Periwinkle, naturally seemed to conveniently overlook. I took photos, carefully noting dates and times, ensuring no people were in the shots, and I was always on public property or my own. This wasn't about shaming my neighbors, it was about demonstrating a pattern of selective enforcement if it existed. If Henderson was truly concerned about community standards, then those standards should apply to everyone equally, not just to those who questioned his authority or whose hobbies he didn't understand. My research into state HOA laws also bore fruit. I found several statutes that emphasized the need for HOAs to act reasonably and fairly, and that any restrictions had to be clearly articulated in the governing documents. Vague, catch-all clauses were often challengeable if applied arbitrarily. The more I learned, the more confident I became that the HOA's case against me was built on sand. Their primary weapon was intimidation and the assumption that homeowners would rather pay a fine or throw out their possessions than engage in a protracted dispute. They hadn't counted on someone with the time, the inclination, and the methodical mindset to call their bluff. Sarah Miller also gave me another tip. check the HOA's own adherence to its bylaws regarding meeting notifications, quorum requirements, and the proper recording and availability of minutes. Sometimes, she said with a grin, the enforcers are the biggest rule breakers. This opened up a whole new line of inquiry. The battle lines were drawn, but I felt I was no longer just defending, I was gathering the ammunition for a counteroffensive. The daily fine notices kept coming, like annoying gnats, but now they felt less like threats and more like Henderson digging his own hole deeper. Each one was another piece of evidence of their unreasonable behavior. My garage, my sanctuary of ordered creativity, had become the unlikely epicenter of a fight for fairness, and I was more determined than ever to see it through. The sheer volume of paperwork I was accumulating was impressive. My dining room table, normally reserved for Clara's intricate jigsaw puzzles or our occasional dinner parties, had transformed into a war room. There were stacks of HOA correspondence, highlighted CC and RS, printouts of state statutes, photographs, and my own meticulously crafted timelines and notes. Clara, initially worried about the stress, now found herself engrossed, offering surprisingly sharp insights and proofreading my increasingly legalistic letters. "You know, Mark," she said one evening, peering over my shoulder at a draft response to Harold Banks, "you missed your calling. You should have been a lawyer," I chuckled. "I prefer building things that work, Clara, not arguing about things that don't. But this is a different kind of engineering problem." My strategic plan was beginning to crystallize. It wasn't enough to just defend, I needed to proactively dismantle their entire premise. Their case rested on the vague accusation of a hoarder garage, a term they'd conveniently failed to define, and claims of fire hazard and unsightly condition which I believed were demonstrably false or misapplied. So, my plan had several prongs. First, the definition. I drafted a formal letter to the HOA board and Harold Banks, once again requesting, in the most unambiguous terms, their official written definition of a hoarder garage as it pertained to the CC and RS. I asked for the specific criteria, measurable standards, and any adopted guidelines or resolutions that empowered them to make such a determination for an enclosed, private garage. I pointed out that without such a definition, their accusation was arbitrary and capricious. I cited a couple of state law precedents Sarah Miller had helped me find, where courts had ruled against HOAs for enforcing unwritten or overly vague rules. Second, the safety issue. The fire hazard claim was their most potent scare tactic, but also their weakest link against someone with my background. I decided to take it head-on. I contacted the local fire marshal's office. I explained the situation, an HOA dispute, vague accusations, and asked if they offered advisory inspections or could provide general guidelines for residential garage safety. A very helpful deputy marshal, a woman named Captain Eva Rostova, listened patiently. While she couldn't formally inspect to take sides in an HOA dispute, she offered to do an informal walkthrough and provide a letter of observations regarding fire safety compliance based on standard codes. I jumped at the chance. Captain Rostova visited the following week. I walked her through my garage, explaining my storage systems, the electrical setup, all to code, naturally, the placement of fire extinguishers, and the clear access pathways. She was thorough, professional, and asked pointed questions. At the end, she nodded. "Mr. Jenkins, from what I can see, your garage appears to be well organized with respect to fire safety. Your extinguishers are appropriate and accessible, your wiring seems sound, and you have maintained clear egress. I see no immediate fire hazards here that would violate standard municipal codes." She provided me with a formal letter on fire department letterhead a few days later, outlining her observations. It didn't explicitly say this is not a fire hazard for HOA purposes, but it strongly implied it by confirming compliance with all relevant safety standards. This letter was gold. Third, the unsightly condition and selective enforcement. My collection of photographs of other properties in the neighborhood, including Henderson's own yard, was growing. I wasn't going to use this to attack my neighbors, but rather to illustrate a point, if necessary, that the HOA's aesthetic standards were either inconsistently applied or that my garage interior, invisible to the public, was being held to a different, unwritten standard. Fourth, the HOA's own procedural missteps. Following Sarah's advice, I formally requested copies of HOA meeting minutes for the past 2 years, financial statements, and records of any board votes or decisions related to the enforcement of Section 7, Subsection B, Paragraph 4, particularly concerning garage interiors. This was where things might get interesting. If they had failed to follow their own bylaws in making decisions or in the selective application of rules, their entire case could unravel. I bundled these requests and my formal letter demanding definitions into a comprehensive package and sent it, again, via certified mail to Henderson, the entire board, and Harold Banks. I also included copies of all the fine dispute letters I had sent, creating a single, undeniable record of my position and their escalating, unsupported demands. The sheer weight of the envelope must have given them pause. This wasn't the response of a cowed homeowner. This was the response of someone who had done their homework and was prepared to fight. Clara and I even role-played potential conversations. She would play Harold Banks, all smooth condescension, and I would practice my calm, factual rebuttals. It sounds a bit silly, I know, but it helped me organize my thoughts and anticipate their arguments. It also provided some much-needed comic relief. Her imitation of Banks's oily tones was spot on. "Mr. Jenkins," she'd drawl, "your recalcitrance is most unneighborly," and I'd reply, "Mr. Banks, your HOA's attempt to legislate the interior of my private garage is most unconstitutional, or at least unreasonable." We'd dissolve into laughter, but beneath it my resolve hardened. I was no longer just reacting. I was setting the terms of the engagement. They had thrown down a gauntlet based on flimsy pretenses, and I was picking it up, armed not with outrage but with meticulously compiled facts, well-reasoned arguments, and the unwavering belief that I was in the right. The ball was now firmly in their court. How would Mr. Henderson and his legal eagle, Mr. Banks, respond to a homeowner who refused to be bullied and was, in fact, turning their own bureaucratic processes against them? I almost looked forward to their next move. Almost. The daily stress was still a low hum in the background, but it was increasingly overshadowed by a sense of purpose and, dare I say it, a certain grim satisfaction in the meticulous construction of my defense, or rather my counteroffensive. My garage, once just a place for my hobbies, had become a symbol. And I was going to defend it, and the principles it represented, with everything I had. The HOA's response to my comprehensive package was, initially, a deafening silence. For nearly 2 weeks, no new fine notices arrived, no blustering letters from Harold Banks, no irate calls from Arthur Henderson. It was an unnerving quiet, like the lull before a storm. Clara and I speculated endlessly. Were they regrouping, consulting more expensive lawyers? Or, miracle of miracles, had they actually read my submission and realized the weakness of their position? Sarah Miller, my paralegal ally, cautioned patience. "They're probably trying to figure out how to respond without admitting they overstepped," she said. "Bureaucracies hate admitting mistakes. And Henderson's ego is probably a factor." She was right, of course. The silence was finally broken not by a letter of apology or withdrawal, but by a slightly less aggressive, though still firm, communication from Harold Banks. It acknowledged receipt of my voluminous correspondence. I smirked at that. Yes, it was voluminous by design, and stated that the board was reviewing the information provided. It made no mention of halting the now suspended fines, nor did it address my specific requests for definitions or records. It was a stalling tactic, pure and simple. But then something interesting happened. I received a separate, rather flustered-looking letter from Agnes Periwinkle, the HOA secretary, in response to my request for records. It contained a patchy assortment of meeting minutes, heavily redacted in places, and a statement that no specific board votes or resolutions exist solely pertaining to the definition or enforcement of garage interior standards beyond the general provisions of the CC and RS. This was significant. If there were no specific board resolutions or adopted guidelines defining Hoarder garage, or how Section 7, subsection B, paragraph 4 applied to garage interiors, it massively strengthened my argument that their actions were arbitrary. The redacted minutes also piqued my curiosity. What were they hiding? Sarah suggested that the redactions themselves might be improper if they weren't justified under specific exemptions in the state's HOA transparency laws. This gave me another angle to pursue if needed. The real counteroffensive, however, began with the fire marshal's letter. I decided it was too good a piece of evidence to keep to myself until a potential court case. I scanned Captain Rostova's letter with its official fire department letterhead and attached it to a new communication I was preparing. This communication was not just a letter, it was a meticulously crafted document, almost a legal brief in its thoroughness. I titled it, Formal Rebuttal and Request for Dismissal of All Allegations and Rescission of Fines Regarding Property at 124 Willow Creek Drive. In it, I systematically addressed every point they had raised. The Hoarder garage accusation. I reiterated their failure to provide a definition, cited Agnes Periwinkle's admission of no specific board resolutions, and contrasted their vague accusation with the dictionary and psychological definitions of hoarding, none of which applied to my organized, functional space. I included my own detailed photographic inventory, clearly labeling sections like woodworking tools and supplies, organized for project access, charity drive collection point sorted and boxed for upcoming distribution, and classic motorcycle restoration project parts inventoried and stored systematically. The fire hazard claim. This was where Captain Rostova's letter shone. I quoted her observations directly and attached the full letter as an appendix. I pointed out my own professional background as a retired electrical engineer with extensive knowledge of safety codes. I challenged them to produce any credible evidence from a qualified professional that contradicted the fire marshal's observations. The unsightly condition claim, I argued that this clause, by any reasonable interpretation, applied to conditions visible to the public and impacting the community, not the interior of a private, closed garage. I stated that their interpretation represented a significant overreach of HOA authority into private property rights. I also, very subtly, hinted at my awareness of potential selective enforcement by mentioning that community standards, if consistently and fairly applied, should focus on genuinely problematic and publicly visible issues. I didn't include my photos of other properties yet. That was an ace I was keeping up my sleeve for a direct confrontation, if needed. Procedural irregularities. I politely questioned the basis for the redactions in the minutes provided and reiterated my request for full transparency as per state law. Demand for action. I formally demanded the immediate dismissal of all allegations, the rescission of all fines, which I calculated now totaled a ludicrous sum, and a written apology for the harassment and distress caused. I concluded by stating that if the HOA continued to pursue this baseless action, I would be forced to seek legal remedies, including a counterclaim for harassment, abuse of process, legal fees, and damages for slander due to their use of the pejorative and defamatory term hoarder. I also hinted that I would explore options to hold board members, including Mr. Henderson, personally liable if they were found to be acting outside the scope of their legitimate authority or in bad faith. I sent this document, all 20 pages including appendices, via certified mail to Harold Banks and each individual member of the HOA board. I wanted to make sure every single one of them understood the full scope of their misjudgment. I knew this was a gamble. It could push them into a corner, making them more entrenched. Or it could be the shock they needed to see reason. The next HOA meeting was scheduled in 10 days. I made a mental note to attend. I had a feeling it might be illuminating. Clara read my rebuttal document with a mixture of awe and trepidation. "Mark, this is formidable," she said. "Are you sure you want to be this aggressive?" "Clara," I replied. "They called me a hoarder, threatened me with lawsuits, and tried to fine me into submission over the contents of my own garage. They started this fight with aggression disguised as bureaucracy. I'm simply responding with facts, logic, and a clear statement of my rights. Sometimes the only way to deal with a bully is to punch back, metaphorically speaking, with overwhelming evidence. The waiting period after sending that document was tense. I found myself checking the mail obsessively, my stomach clenching every time the phone rang with an unknown number. But this time, the silence felt different. It wasn't the quiet of them ignoring me, it felt like the quiet of frantic internal discussions, perhaps even panic. My counteroffensive was launched. Now it was a waiting game to see where the pieces would land. The HOA's reaction to my formal rebuttal was, predictably, somewhat chaotic, though it unfolded in stages. The first indication that my salvo had hit its mark came not from Henderson or Banks, but indirectly through Sarah Miller. She called me a few days after I'd sent my document. "Mark," she said, a hint of amusement in her voice, "you've certainly stirred the hornet's nest. I heard from a friend on the social committee that Henderson called an emergency closed-door board meeting last night. Apparently, your letter was the sole topic of discussion and things got pretty heated. According to Sarah's source, my detailed rebuttal, particularly the fire marshal's letter and the veiled threat of personal liability for board members, had caused a significant rift. Some board members who had perhaps passively gone along with Henderson's vendetta were now getting cold feet. The prospect of being personally sued rather than the HOA as an entity was a powerful motivator. Harold Banks, their lawyer, was reportedly apoplectic at first, then deeply concerned about the strength of my documented position and the potential for a costly, embarrassing legal defeat. He had apparently advised them that my claims of arbitrary enforcement and lack of defined standards had merit, and the fire marshal's letter effectively neutralized their safety argument. The next official communication I received was surprisingly conciliatory, though it still reeked of face-saving. It was a letter from Harold Banks, but his tone was markedly different. Gone was the condescending arrogance, replaced by a more cautious, almost lawyerly neutrality. He stated that the board had carefully considered my submission and, in the spirit of community harmony and without any admission of wrongdoing, they were prepared to discuss a resolution. He proposed a private meeting between myself, him, and Mr. Henderson to find a mutually agreeable path forward. No mention of dropping the fines or the accusations outright, but it was a significant climb down from their previous ultimatums. I discussed this with Clara and Sarah. Sarah's advice was sharp. They're trying to get you into a room to negotiate you down from a position of strength. Don't let them. Your position is solid. Why compromise when you're right? I agreed. A mutually agreeable path forward sounded like they wanted me to concede something, to give them an out. I wasn't inclined to. I replied to Banks, politely declining a private meeting at that stage. I reiterated that my position was clearly outlined in my rebuttal and that the only mutually agreeable path forward I envisioned was the complete withdrawal of all allegations, the rescission of all fines, and a formal acknowledgement that the matter was closed. I added that I would be attending the upcoming public HOA meeting and was prepared to discuss the matter there, in an open forum if they wished. This, I knew, would put them on the spot. A public airing of their flimsy case, especially with my documentation in hand, was probably Henderson's worst nightmare. The days leading up to the HOA meeting were filled with a nervous energy. I prepared a concise summary of my case, complete with copies of key documents, the fire marshal's letter, snippets from the CC and RS, Agnes Periwinkle's admission about no specific garage rules. I wasn't planning a lengthy presentation unless provoked, but I wanted to be ready. The meeting night arrived. The community clubhouse was more crowded than usual. Word had clearly gotten around that something was brewing. I saw several familiar faces, including some of the neighbors I discreetly observed with their own sightly issues. Sarah Miller gave me a supportive nod as I took a seat near the front. Arthur Henderson sat at the head table looking unusually subdued. Agnes Periwinkle fidgeted with her pen, and the other board members seemed to be avoiding eye contact with Henderson and each other. Harold Banks was also present, looking deeply uncomfortable in a too small folding chair. After the usual procedural nonsense, Henderson cleared his throat. Next on the agenda, he mumbled, is an update on a compliance matter regarding property maintenance. He looked at Banks, who gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. This was not going as Henderson had planned. I saw my opportunity. I raised my hand. Mr. President, I said, my voice clear and steady, if this compliance matter refers to the accusations made against my property at 124 Willow Creek Drive, I believe it would be beneficial for the community to understand the full context and the HOA's basis for these actions, especially given the significant amount of time and resources, both mine and the HOA's, that have been expended. There was a murmur through the room. Henderson's face flushed a dull red. He looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him. Banks leaned over and whispered something to him. Henderson then said, Mr. Jenkins, the board is reviewing this matter. We propose to discuss it privately with you to reach an amicable. Mr. Henderson, I interrupted, still polite but firm, I have already responded to Mr. Banks's suggestion for a private meeting. My position is that this matter, which has involved public accusations and the threat of legal action funded by all homeowners' dues, deserves a transparent resolution. I held up my summary document, a detailed rebuttal to the HOA's claims, including a letter from the fire marshal confirming my garage meets all safety codes, and evidence suggesting the HOA has no clearly defined or consistently applied standards for what constitutes a hoarder garage or an unsightly interior. I am happy to share this with any interested homeowner. More murmurs. A few people looked intrigued. This was clearly not the controlled narrative Henderson and Banks had hoped for. Banks stood up. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, his voice smooth but strained. The board takes all homeowner concerns seriously. In light of new information provided by Mr. Jenkins, and to ensure all procedures are correctly followed, the board has decided to table further action on this specific matter pending a more thorough internal review of its policies regarding private property interiors and aesthetic guidelines. All pending fines related to this specific issue will be suspended during this review. Suspended? Not rescinded? Not good enough. Mr. Banks? I pressed. Suspending fines is not the same as acknowledging they were improperly levied. And tabling further action is not the same as dismissing baseless accusations. My family has been subjected to considerable stress and harassment over this. I believe the homeowners here deserve to know if their HOA is acting within its rights and applying rules fairly and consistently. This was the moment. The air crackled. Henderson looked like he was about to explode. But then an unexpected voice came from the audience. It was old Mr. Abernathy, a longtime resident known for his quiet demeanor. I think Mr. Jenkins has a point, he said, his voice surprisingly strong. Some of us have wondered about how these rules are made up and applied. My shed isn't the tittiest, but no one's threatened me with lawsuits, another voice, then another. People started sharing their own minor grievances, their own feelings of being overlooked or unfairly targeted for petty things. The dam of polite silence was breaking. Henderson was losing control of his own meeting. It was no longer just about my garage, it was about the HOA's overall governance. The atmosphere in the clubhouse had shifted dramatically. What started as Arthur Henderson's attempt to quietly manage a compliance issue had morphed into an impromptu forum on HOA governance with my Hoarder garage saga as the catalyst. Harold Banks, sensing the tide turning against his clients, tried to regain control. Ladies and gentlemen, please, he interjected, his voice louder now, trying to project authority. This is not the appropriate venue for airing individual grievances. The board is committed to fairness and will, as I stated, conduct a thorough review. Mr. Jenkins's specific case will be part of that review, but it was like trying to put toothpaste back in the tube. Sarah Miller stood up. With all due respect, Mr. Banks, she said, her paralegal training evident in her precise language. If the board is reviewing its policies because Mr. Jenkins has highlighted potential overreach and inconsistent application, then isn't it in every homeowner's interest to understand the scope of that review and to ensure it results in clear, fair, and legally sound guidelines? Simply suspending fines and tabling action against Mr. Jenkins doesn't address the underlying problem that he was targeted with vague rules and unsubstantiated claims in the first place. Several people nodded in agreement. Henderson, who had been slumped in his chair looking apoplectic, suddenly found his voice, or rather, his temper. "This is an outrage," he sputtered, his face crimson. "Mr. Jenkins has deliberately flouted community standards. His garage is an embarrassment. We have photographs. Photographs taken from a distance, without context, Mr. Henderson?" I countered calmly, holding up the fire marshal's letter. "Or do you have evidence from a qualified professional that contradicts this assessment from our local fire department, stating my garage presents no fire safety violations? Do you have a written, board-approved definition of Hoarder garage that you can share with us tonight? Because your own secretary, Ms. Periwinkle, confirmed in writing that no such specific resolution exists, Agnes Periwinkle looked like she wanted to disappear under the table. The other board members were visibly squirming. One of them, a quiet woman named Mrs. Davis, who usually just voted along with Henderson, cleared her throat. "Arthur," she said tentatively, perhaps Mr. Jenkins has a point about the clarity of the rules. And the fire marshal's letter, that's quite significant." Henderson shot her a venomous glare, but the crack in the board's united front was visible. Banks, ever the pragmatist, stepped forward again. "All right," he conceded, his tone one of weary resignation. "To expedite resolution and foster community understanding, the board will commit to the following. 1. A comprehensive review of Section 7, Subsection B, Paragraph 4, and all related aesthetic and maintenance guidelines, with a view to establishing clear, objective, and legally defensible standards, particularly concerning private, enclosed spaces not visible from common areas. This review will involve homeowner consultation. 2. Regarding Mr. Jenkins's specific case, in light of the documentation he has provided, particularly the letter from the fire marshal, and without prejudice to the HOA's general authority, the board will formally withdraw all pending violation notices and rescind all fines previously levied against Mr. Jenkins concerning the state of his garage." A collective gasp, then a ripple of applause went through the room. My heart leaped. This was it. This was the capitulation I'd been fighting for. Henderson looked like he'd been poleaxed. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, speechless. "Furthermore," Banks continued, clearly wanting to get this over with, "the board acknowledges Mr. Jenkins's right to utilize his garage for his hobbies and storage in a manner that complies with all applicable safety codes. We trust this resolves the matter to Mr. Jenkins's satisfaction and demonstrates the board's commitment to responsive governance. I stood up. Mr. Banks, Mr. Henderson, members of the board, I said, addressing them and the assembled homeowners. Yes, that largely resolves my personal grievance. I appreciate the board's decision to withdraw the baseless accusations and rescind the fines. I trust that the promised review of policies will lead to greater transparency and fairness for all residents. My intention was never to be disruptive, but simply to protect my rights as a homeowner and to ensure that our community is governed by clear, reasonable, and equitably enforced rules. I looked directly at Henderson. No homeowner should be subjected to vague accusations, threats, and fines based on personal interpretation or selective enforcement. The applause this time was louder and more sustained. Several people came up to shake my hand afterwards, thanking me for standing up to the board. Sarah Miller gave me a high five. You did it, Mark. You actually did it. Even Mrs. Davis, the board member who had spoken up, gave me a small, almost shy smile. Arthur Henderson avoided eye contact, gathering his papers with a grim expression. Harold Banks looked like he desperately needed a strong drink. The aftermath of that meeting was swift. The very next day, I received a formal letter from the HOA signed by a chastened-looking Agnes Periwinkle on behalf of the board, officially withdrawing all violation notices and confirming that all fines related to my garage had been rescinded and voided from my account. There was no apology, of course. That would have been too much to expect, but the language was clear and unequivocal. The battle of the Hoarder garage was over. And I had won. The sense of relief was immense, quickly followed by a deep, quiet satisfaction. It hadn't been easy. It had been stressful, time-consuming, and at times, infuriating. But I had stood my ground, used my skills, gathered my evidence, and refused to be intimidated. Poetic justice, in a small suburban way, had been served. Henderson's power within the HOA was visibly diminished after that meeting. Rumor had it that several board members were privately discussing the need for new leadership at the next election. Mrs. Gable, my suspected initial accuser from across the street, suddenly became very interested in the state of her own overgrown shrubbery. The Hoarder garage accusation, once a source of anger and frustration, now felt like a badge of honor. It was a testament to the fact that one determined individual, armed with facts and a refusal to back down, could indeed fight City Hall, or in this case, the Pleasant Valley Homeowners Association. My garage, my sanctuary, remained just as it was, full, yes, but full of purpose, passion, and now a quiet story of triumph. The weeks following that pivotal HOA meeting settled into a new, more peaceful rhythm. The daily anxiety that had become a constant companion during the dispute slowly receded, replaced by a lingering sense of vindication. My garage, once the subject of so much unwarranted scrutiny, felt even more like my personal haven. I'd walk in, inhale the familiar sense of wood, oil, and old paper, and a small smile would play on my lips. It wasn't just a workshop anymore, it was a monument to a hard-won victory. The promised HOA policy review did actually materialize, though it moved at the glacial pace typical of such committees. Sarah Miller, to my pleasant surprise, volunteered to be on the homeowner consultation panel, ensuring that the process wouldn't just be a whitewash. She'd occasionally give me updates reporting that Henderson was largely sidelined in the discussions and that there was a genuine effort to draft clearer, more objective guidelines. They were even discussing specific language about respecting the privacy of enclosed spaces not visible from common areas, a direct result, I like to think, of my ordeal. Arthur Henderson, for his part, became a much more subdued figure in the neighborhood. His bluster seemed to have deflated. He still attended HOA meetings, but his pronouncements were fewer and far less imperious. At the next HOA board election several months later, he chose not to run for re-election as president, citing a desire to spend more time with his prize-winning petunias. A statement that caused more than a few suppressed chuckles among those who knew the real story. A more moderate, consensus-building resident, Mrs. Davis, in fact, was elected as the new HOA president, ushering in what many hoped would be an era of more reasonable governance. Harold Banks, the HOA's lawyer, I never heard from again directly, though I imagined he'd chalked up the Jenkins file as a particularly aggravating learning experience. The fines, totaling over $2,000 by the time they were rescinded, were wiped from my HOA account as if they'd never existed. I kept the formal withdrawal letter framed, not in the garage as I'd half-jokingly considered, but tucked away in my victory file, a reminder that sometimes the pen and a well-documented case is indeed mightier than the sword. or at least mightier than a bullying HOA president. Clara and I often talked about the whole bizarre episode. You know, she mused one evening as I was back in the garage, happily sanding a piece of cherry wood for a new bookcase. For a while there, I was genuinely worried they'd sue us and we'd have to sell the Bonneville parts to pay the lawyers. I paused my sanding. So was I, a little. But the more they pushed, the more ridiculous their claims seemed, the more determined I became. It stopped being about the stuff in the garage and became about not letting them dictate how we live in our own home based on some vague, arbitrary notion of tidiness. The lessons learned were numerous. Firstly, know your rights and the rules that govern you, in this case, the CC and RS and state HOA laws. Knowledge truly is power. Secondly, document everything. Meticulously. Dates, times, conversations, letters, photographs. That paper trail was my shield and my sword. Thirdly, don't be afraid to challenge authority when it oversteps, but do it intelligently with facts and logic, not just emotion. My engineering background, with its emphasis on systematic problem-solving and evidence-based conclusions, served me far better than angry outbursts would have. Fourthly, seek allies. Sarah Miller's legal insights were invaluable, and even the quiet support of neighbors who shared their own stories helped bolster my resolve. And finally, sometimes the best defense is a well-prepared offense. Turning their own bureaucratic tactics against them, demanding definitions, requesting records, and presenting irrefutable evidence like the fire marshal's letter shifted the balance of power. My relationship with some of my neighbors definitely changed. I earned a new level of respect from many, and a few even approached me for advice on their own minor skirmishes with the HOA. I became, somewhat reluctantly, the neighborhood's unofficial expert on CCNR interpretation. I didn't run for the HOA board myself. I valued my garage time too much, but I did make a point of attending meetings more regularly just to keep an eye on things and ensure the new board stayed on a more reasonable path. The story of the Hoarder garage became a bit of a local legend. New residents would sometimes hear whispers of it. You know that guy in the house with the really neat workshop? The HOA once tried to sue him over it and he totally shut them down. It always brought a smile to my face. My garage continues to be full, a vibrant testament to my hobbies and charitable efforts. The Triumph Bonneville restoration is progressing slowly but surely. The woodworking projects fill our home with handcrafted beauty. The boxes for the charity toy drive are already beginning to fill up for next Christmas. And every now and then, when I open the garage door to let in some fresh air, I almost expect to see Henderson or Agnes Periwinkle lurking across the street with a camera. But they don't. The battle was won, the peace restored, and my Hoarder garage stands as a quiet, well-organized, and thoroughly vindicated symbol of one man's refusal to be bullied by the petty tyrants of Pleasant Valley. It's amazing what you can accomplish when you're defending your sanctuary, armed with a bit of engineering logic and a whole lot of righteous indignation. And perhaps a very helpful letter from the local fire marshal. The dust truly settled in Pleasant Valley. The reign of minor terror instigated by Arthur Henderson over perceived aesthetic slights faded into the realm of neighborhood lore. A cautionary tale whispered among residents about the perils of unchecked HOA power and the quiet hero who meticulously dismantled it. My life, and more importantly, my garage, returned to a state of productive tranquility. The new HOA board under Mrs. Davis's surprisingly capable leadership made genuine efforts towards transparency and fairness. The infamous Section 7, subsection B, paragraph 4 was eventually amended. The new wording, drafted with input from Sarah Miller and other concerned homeowners, now included specific, objective criteria for what constituted a nuisance or unsightly condition, focusing almost exclusively on exterior issues visible from common areas or demonstrable safety hazards documented by relevant authorities. There was even a clause explicitly stating that the interior condition of private, enclosed garages, provided they met fire and building codes and did not emit noxious odors or pests, was generally outside the HOA's aesthetic purview. It was a quiet revolution, and my garage was its unlikely Lexington and Concord. I often reflected on the sheer absurdity of it all. A phone call out of the blue, a smug lawyer, a power-tripping president, and suddenly my passion projects, my organized collections, my very way of life within my own four walls were under attack, branded with the pejorative label, hoarding. It highlighted how easily subjective biases could be weaponized within a system that lacked robust checks and balances. The experience, though stressful, had an unexpectedly positive side effect. It brought me closer to some of my neighbors. The shared fight, even if they were mostly spectators, forged new connections. Mr. Abernathy, who had spoken up at that crucial meeting, would now stop by for a chat when I was working in the garage with the door open, sharing stories of his own woodworking projects from decades past. Sarah Miller became a good friend to both Clara and me. We'd have her over for dinner, and she'd regale us with tales of her legal battles, both professional and now, occasionally, as a vigilant member of the HOA Policy Review Committee. My garage itself became something of a legend. People I barely knew would sometimes comment, "Heard you had quite the tussle over your workshop. Good on you for standing firm." It was a strange sort of local fame, but it underscored a shared frustration with petty bureaucracy that resonated with many. I even made a small, humorous addition to my garage's interior. Tucked away on a shelf next to a particularly well-organized box of vintage vacuum tubes for my radio restorations, I placed a small, custom-engraved plaque. It read, "The Pleasant Valley Hoarder Garage 2023. Investigated. Defended. Vindicated. Fire Marshal approved." Only Clara and I, and perhaps a few select friends who knew the whole story, would understand its full significance, but it served as my private little trophy, a reminder of the battle fought and won. The satisfaction wasn't just in winning, but in how it was won, not through yelling or aggression, but through meticulous preparation, leveraging my own skills and using their own rules and logic against them. It was an engineer's victory. The Triumph Bonneville project saw significant progress. With the HOA off my back, I could dedicate more focused weekends to it. The engine was rebuilt, gleaming and ready. The frame was painted a deep British racing green. Each part, once cataloged and stored, was now being carefully reassembled. It was a metaphor, in a way, for how I had deconstructed the HOA's case and then rebuilt my own peace of mind. One afternoon, months later, Clara came into the garage while I was polishing a newly chromed fender. "You know," she said, leaning against my workbench, "I was thinking about Mr. Henderson. Do you ever feel sorry for him?" I paused, considering. Henderson had been arrogant, petty, and a bully. But in the end, he was also just a man who had let a little bit of power go to his head and who had been publicly humbled. "Sorry? Not exactly," I replied. "But I do hope he learned something. Maybe about the limits of his authority or about underestimating people. Mostly, I just feel relieved that chapter is closed," and it was. The calls I got now were from friends or from the charity asking about toy drive logistics, not from condescending lawyers. The letters in my mailbox were magazines about woodworking or classic bikes, not threatening demands from an overzealous HOA. The peace in my garage was no longer a fragile thing, constantly under threat, but a robust and well-earned tranquility. The experience had armed me not with bitterness, but with a reinforced belief in the importance of standing up for oneself, of meticulousness, and of the quiet power of well-reasoned defiance. And it taught me that even in the most placid-seeming suburban landscapes, vigilance is sometimes required to protect your own little slice of paradise, especially if that paradise happens to be a garage filled to the brim with the wonderful, organized clutter of a life well lived. The scent of cedar and old oil never smelled sweeter.